Hello, hello to everyone from wherever you're joining us. This is, I think, the 9th or the 10th event of Greek Studies Now, a torch University of Oxford and University of Amsterdam network on modern Greek studies, on rethinking modern Greek studies in the 21st century, that has been going on for, more than a year now. This is our first event for this academic year, but you can join us, see more events, and look at all the work that we've been doing on our dedicated website, greekstudiesnow.org. My name is Dimitris Papanikolaou. I'm professor at the University of Oxford, and with colleagues Maria Boletsi and Christina Girgaudaite, and so many others who joined us on the way, we put this network together in order to rethink what it means to be doing Greek studies at this moment, in this particular period, and with a view both to the past, but also to the future. Issues such as history, culture, literature, but also questions such as citizenship, identity are very central in what we are trying to do here. Again, you can look at our dedicated website to see all the other work that we have been doing. As we have done in the past, today we have invited two guest editors for this event. It is an event that you know from the title will focus on Albanian-Greek identity. And we've invited two colleagues, Regina Donsi and Linda Cesa, to both curate it and chair it. Without further ado, therefore, I want to, but also without forgetting to thank Torch, which is hosting us today, the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities. I want to pass on now to Linda Cesa, who will introduce speakers, the event, and her co-curator, co-chair. Thank you very much to all of you who are here, and thank you very much, Regina and Linda, for organizing that. It means a lot to us, and we're looking forward to a great set of presentations and discussion. Thank you. Oh, and I need to, things that I want to forget. I need to, of course, introduce you, Linda. Linda Cesa, who will speak immediately after me, is a colleague from the University of Amsterdam, the School for Cultural Analysis. She's currently writing her PhD thesis on the visualization of the arrival of refugees in the various Greek media. She examines images from documentaries, photojournalism, and TV broadcast programs, and tries to identify forms of hospitality and responsibility that emerge in those visual narratives. Apologies, I forgot to properly introduce you, Linda, and the mic is for you. I mean, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dimitris. Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for having the idea to organize such a roundtable, which I find profoundly important, that we have this space to address this question that has been important to us, haunting us in some ways, being so difficult to get a really definite answer. And we don't even, I think, we don't even have to have a definite answer in that. But it's such an important event for us to have this space to think among us and with other people that might join us from YouTube right now, and think about Greek Albanian identity, Albanian Greek identity, if it exists and in what ways it exists, should it exist, do we need such an identity? So from my own perspective that I'm going to address this question, because I cannot have, I don't have results of asking every Albanian how they feel. So the only way that I can do is a cultural act of self-reading. So, and when I think about it, I'm thinking in terms that what I am, and that the only definite answer that I have to this question is that I don't fully belong to any community, and still I belong, but in what ways do I belong? So when I think of the Albanianness, I have to take us back to the 90s, for maybe people that are not aware of the situation of being Albanian back then in Greece, and what version of Albanianness I'm addressing, because the version changed through the time, like from the 90s to 2000 to 2021. So the first version, I think it was the most difficult for us because we had to deal with dehumanizing discourses in the public sphere from politicians, jokes, and the whole discourse of being Albanian has been really tough. Like how you could identify with an identity that was actually saying that you are not quite human, you're not enough. So, and it was a constant battle and fear and shame for being part of that identity. And I cannot reject that in the first years, it felt so difficult to claim that identity. And although it didn't feel difficult for me, because the subject themselves, they don't feel like there is something wrong, but there is the cultural norms that give them discourses about themselves, and they identify them in ways that they just have to deal with it and to examine and to think about it. So my own self-identification happened in these years through not of the question of who I am, but who I am not. So this question of who I'm not, that I had to disidentify from the Albanian identity of being dirty, destitute, criminal, a bit less than the other ones. But I do think that there has been a change in the version of Albanianness that we can think about nowadays, although it still exists some institutional and everyday racism, and for sure hierarchical relations that take place in the ways that people still live in the country. So another thing that I want to address is that the version of Albanianness that I can talk about, and the Albanianness that I can claim, is what it means to be Albanian, but Albanian in a way that the Albanian that grew up in Greek, the Albanian of this migration, because I cannot identify with the Albanian that was born and raised in Albania, because by the times that I've been there and the times that I've been there, I've seen that I cannot translate some cultural aspects because I didn't live there. And although I am part of the Greek culture and I live there, and I can definitely feel more confident in translations of the language and the jokes and the everyday life, and still I cannot even claim that identity, because the Greek identity is based on the concept of we are Greeks because of our ancestors were there, and maybe goes back to even to ancient Greece. So definitely this question has always been a trap. Where are you from? And then you cannot really fully answer. So although later I migrated again and I came to Netherlands, and I still felt, and then I realized that some versions of me from the, being Albanian were still haunting me even here, in a different aspect of racism that happens to face in my life. Like the version of the Albanian criminal, it was a surprising that I even found it here. The thing that I found different here is that if in Greece I felt like being this version of some criminality, it's also like there's something inherent in the Albanian subject that you cannot get rid of it. The version that I see that I encounter in Netherlands is that there is the identity of this criminality aspect of Albanian, but only like not that you're not proper human, you are the bad version of human. But at least it wasn't that dehumanizing as I experienced it in Greece. However, in Greece, I also have felt like forms of generosity and hospitality. And that's the reason that what I took from that encounters, and I thought that I should do my PhD on the question of ethical responsibility and what do we owe to the others. So definitely my experience has shaped me a lot in what I do and how I think today, and how I take this experience to my own work. But so if I could say like shortly, like, is there a Greek Albanian, Albanian-Greek identity? I could only claim this identity if there will also be a space for us to claim the Greekness, if you can equally claim the Albanianness. If this was an identity that we had to leave behind, we have to erase in order to be quite Greek. I think that I would like to claim my Greekness only if I'm allowed to create my Albanianness, at least the version of it that developed through these years. And that's my small contribution for today. And I would like to invite the other co-organizer of this event, who is Regina Donsi, and I'm about to introduce her just right now. So, hi Regina, are you here? Do you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. So, so Regina has completed her bachelor's degree in English language and literature at the National and Kapodistria University of Athens. She now lives in Columbus, Ohio, where she's doing her PhD at the Department of Linguistics, the Ohio State University. At the same department, she teaches introductory linguistics and sociolinguistics undergraduate courses, as well as introductory linguistics courses to high schoolers in the department's Summer Linguistics Institute for Youth Scholars. Her research is located in the field of sociolinguistics with a focus on the linguistic construction of Albanianness in Greece and the social evaluation of Albanian accented Greek. Gina is also a research assistant at the Laboratory for Greek Dialectology at Ohio State, where among others they conduct research on the Greek of South Albania and the linguistic practices of Greek Albanian bilinguals there.
Thank you, Linda. And also would like to thank the Greek Studies Now network, Maria, Dimitris, Christina, Claudio, and the others for giving us the opportunity to open this conversation on the topic of Albanian-Greek identity. I'm very grateful, as you said, as you said, Linda, to be given the space, right, to discuss this this particular topic with this particular panel makeup, right, which not only makes it for sort of like a safer environment for us to have this conversation in, but also makes for a space that we get to talk about our identity, and through our lived experience, of course, and our work. This panel came about sort of through conversations, as Dimitris was saying earlier, that we've been having, right, on this topic, and they were sort of generous to sort of like invite us to actually talk about this in this more public space. And I'm very grateful also to the panelists today, Eno Agoli, Ervin Kondakciu, Ilira Liai, and Neritan Zingiria for accepting our invitations. We didn't even have to pressure them too much, for accepting our invitations and joining us here today. And I'm sure we're going to be hearing very exciting things from them very shortly. So I see this roundtable as continuing the conversation that was opened up by the roundtable that was hosted by the same team on race and ethnicity. The roundtable was titled "We Have Never Been Racist," took place last May. And even though we're sort of having this second instantiation on ethnicity and race, I think we're still only beginning to scratch the surface on this topic, at least in the context of Greece. So before we start, I should have put a disclaimer out there that our panel consists of individuals that are engaged in the arts and education and right in there in academia, and the majority of them have, although they have been raised in Greece, have been living outside of the country for a few years now. So that means their opinions and viewpoints, right, might not necessarily reflect those of others that do not have our exact biographies. But at the same time, and I think these sort of like parts of our biographies, and I think some of the panelists will be discussing this in more detail very soon, is what allowed us to think about identity and our identities in the ways that you will hear here today. And I say ways, right? I use plural here on purpose because I think you will hear different takes on this identity today, which is okay, right? Because there's no single way to do identity. And I wanted also to provide some context, right? Linda already gave some, but I'm sort of like, I'm gonna sort of like add on that, or maybe repeat some other stuff that Linda already said. For those of you, right, who are watching, attending the Zoom panel, or those attending from YouTube, right, that are not very familiar with the situation in the Balkans. So Albania was a socialist country, as with other Eastern European countries. The beginning of the 1990s, I'm sorry, marked the end of socialism and the transition to democracy. During the time of communism, Albania was one of the most isolated countries in the world, extremely poor, and Albanians were desperate, right, to see what's beyond the border. And of course, right, Greece is just south of Albania, and one of the main places, right, Albanians started migrating to when they eventually became where they eventually became the largest migrant group. Quite like what happens in other situations of migration, Albanians were perceived as a threat, as Linda said, and there was a lot, right, of dehumanizing and xenophobic sentiment that was expressed towards them. And in the Greek consciousness, quite frankly, they were sort of like marked as these criminal, right, and culturally inferior beings. Of course, as Linda also said, there were cases where Albanians received a more positive treatment, and I'm sure other panelists will also comment on this. But this is what has marked my experience growing up in Greece. So now, 30 years later in Greece, they like to talk about the integration of Albanians and about how we have turned a page in the relationship between Greeks and Albanians. However, the way that I perceived it, I don't think that, not just me, but sort of like there are studies about this, right? The xenophobic discourses have not completely disappeared, but a lot of them, right, have moved into this realm of microaggressions, which is harder to detect. So we find glimpses of this in how people talk about Albanians on the Greek Twitter, like a study from Pondiki et al. In 2020, and in my own work, in how listeners perceive Albanian accented Greek, and what sort of like versions of Albanianness that are constructed on Greek internet memes. So with regards to whether there is such a thing as an Albanian-Greek identity, I would also have to respond no. And I think the last comments made by Linda sort of like feed very nicely into what I'm about to say, and which I will explain with some personal examples. So I very much agree with Linda that we cannot have a dual or hyphenated identity where the environment we live in demands from us that we shed every indication of our Albanianness off of us. It demands that we reject our Albanian sounding or foreign sounding names, as we've seen with people changing or tweaking their names, right, to make them sound more Greek or Greek passing. To give you a personal example, right, on this, on how sort of like names are important in sort of framing a Greek identity. When the public servant at my local eforia, right, my tax office, told me in the most condescending like way, "Πολύ ελληνικό όνομα," right, what a Greek name, and threw my documents in front of me in the most condescending and humiliating way when I went there to update my file with my newly acquired Greek ID. It also demands that we reject our mother tongue, as evidenced by the limited or lack of proficiency for second-generation migrants in Greece, and the high proficiency, right, that they conversely acquire in Greek. This is sort of evidenced also a couple of years ago. This sort of like demand to reject our mother tongue, right, is evidenced also was evidenced a couple of years ago at the start of extracurricular Albanian language classes in a middle school in Chania, in Crete. That was met with aggressive reactions, right, by both Greek students and parents, which resulted in catalepsis. By the way, the classes are happening now today, and the community did not give up, even though at first, right, they were temporarily halted. Moreover, demands that we reject our religion, right, as we've seen with baptisms, and push towards Greek Orthodoxy. And then, of course, it requires that we replace all those rejected Albanian elements with their respective Greek elements in order to maybe start having a claim in the Greek identity. And even then, I think once we've done all that, it seems that it's not enough, right? And we're still perceived as this culturally inferior other. For example, again, to sort of give personal examples, I was not seen as worthy or capable of being a teacher, right? So this was made clear to me when my employer at a foreign language center in Greece, in one Aphrodisiria where I used to work, asked me to not disclose to students or parents that I was Albanian. And I didn't tell anyone because I really understood that this might have damaged their business, right? So as a result, it would have damaged my own work. Parents might have withdrawn their children and enrolled them to a different language. And also, we are not seen as capable of academic success, right? And I have this sort of like, this happened to me a couple of years ago, where this otherwise well-meaning Greek woman was shocked and exclaimed, and you're so worthy, when she learned I was Albanian and a PhD student. And this is systemic too, right? So this is not just sort of like what's happening sort of like at the ground level with the people we interact. To give a personal example, in 2016, after graduating from the Department of English Studies, which mainly produces English teachers in Greece, I went to a branch of the Ministry of Education, the Greek Ministry of Education, called EOPEP, to apply for my teaching license like all my college peers did. Only to be told I could not get the license because I was not Greek or a European citizen or a European Union citizen. And because at the time I was still waiting on my Greek citizenship application status. And it wouldn't change anything when I clarified that no, like I received my bachelor's degree from a Greek institution, University of Athens. It's not an Albanian university. But still this didn't change much or anything. So what I understood from this interaction, right, what was conveyed to me is that I did have a green card. This gave me access to the job market, so I could be employed legally, but I could not do the work that basically my studies prepared me to do, right? I was not allowed to hold the quote unquote, right, prestigious job, right, being a teacher and educating the children of Greece. However, I was still allowed to work in an unskilled job, even though I don't really like this term, as a waitress, as a shop assistant, and so on and so forth. So even then, after we sacrifice our ethnic identity over another, we're still not allowed to claim our new identity as our own, right? So Greekness is denied to us. And I'm not really sure what is left for us out there to claim. I don't really have a good answer for you. Nevertheless, Greece, and I'm going to be referring here to Greece as sort of like a human entity, because in the past, when I say Greeks, I've encountered people sort of like pushing back and feeling personally attacked. So Greece expects us to claim that we do not feel Albanian as well, right? Or that we feel more Greek than Albanian. And this is something that Odysseus and I recently admitted that he felt pressured to do in the early 2000s when he as a star student back then was forced to twice give up carrying the Greek flag at the student parade. We're also expected to denounce our Albanianness in order to affirm, right, sort of like this idea that Greece has, right, about this cultural superiority over other Europeans, right, to reassure Greece that we're not threats, right, to care for its serenity and happiness. It demands us to care about its feelings, right, but what about our feelings, right? Who will tend to them? I have to admit I've been jealous of people in the US calling themselves Greek American, Albanian American, Mexican American, and so on and so forth, embracing, right, and being proud of their heritage. I guess this is how I also got interested in these hyphenated identities and started imagining myself as having one. I still haven't decided, by the way. But it feels that both Greeks and Albanians cannot accept having Albanian and Greek sort of like next to each other, right? They seem to be sort of like direct opposites clashing, right? And they cannot be imagined as being complementary, or at least not in clash. On the one hand, right, we have this sort of like imposed shame that also Linda talked about of being an Albanian in Greece and everything I listed previously. And on the other hand, right, we have this guilt and sense of betrayal that comes from Albanians who wonder, right, how can we identify with a nation that treats our compatriots like that? As a linguist, I cannot not reflect on the fact that we're holding this conversation in English. I have to admit, I'm relieved I do not have to choose between Albanian or Greek, because I understand that these choices can have meaning, can convey a message to my audience, right? Whether that is the Greeks, Albanians, etc. A language choice might even give off the impression that I'm making a choice between an Albanian or Greek identity. I'm therefore glad to do this in English, which in this context I see as a neutral language, because it's not Greek or Albanian. Right, so I know that this language makes it also easier for me to talk about these first very personal things. I understand this is a language that makes the event more inclusive, right, to a broader audience interested in these dual identities. But at the same time, I'm aware that it excludes other interested parties, such as people like my parents, right, who do not speak English and who admittedly are not represented in this roundtable. Finally, I would like to say that I'm optimistic, nevertheless, that these roundtables are slowly happening, right, and starting the tough conversations that we need to be having in Greece. We cannot just keep ignoring them, right? We're in the danger then of fooling ourselves that these things do not exist, that do not happen in our country, right? And no positive change can come out of being in denial. And with that, I will close and move on to introduce our first panelist, Eno Agoli. Eno was born in 1994 in Korçë, Albania. He grew up in Thessaloniki, Greece, where his family moved in 1997. In 2012, at 18, he moved to the US, where he studied philosophy at the University of Chicago. Eno has studied also philosophy at a postgraduate level at the Universities of Cambridge, Connecticut, Notre Dame, and Rutgers, where he is currently a PhD student. His area of specialization is formal logic and semantics. Eno is also a poet writing in Greek. His first book of poetry was published in 2015 by the Thesis Publications and was awarded the Varvaris Prize for Emerging Poets in 2016. His poems have also appeared in print and online in several literary magazines, such as Chronos, Odos Panos, Diasticho, and others. Some of his poems were recently translated in Albanian by Sokol Chunga in his 2021 anthology of contemporary Greek poetry. He splits his time between New Brunswick, New Jersey, and New London, Connecticut. Eno.
Thank you, Regina, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. This is great. I think it's a conversation we ought to be having. And I really look forward to hearing the opinions of the other panelists here. I should say that I agree with a lot of what you said, and obviously I share a lot of the experiences with you. But I disagree with the main sort of conclusion that you were arguing for. And I want to suggest that, yes, there is a type of Greek Albanian identity, maybe a very rudimentary type, but I think there is something of a genesis of a Greek Albanian identity, and I'll try to convince you about that. But this will not be the main focus of my little speech. I will mostly be concerned with the issue of invisibility or visibility of that identity. And what got me into thinking about this is a DNA result I got about a year ago on my own ancestry. And there were two surprising results there. The first one had to do with some sort of Egyptian DNA that caused a mini identity crisis in my family. But bracketing that, you can see in one of these pictures on the right that a lot of my DNA seems to sort of span both Greece and Albania, most of it actually. And the second surprise was that most of it seems to come from the Peloponnese, which was completely unexpected. We don't have any family that comes from there. And this got me thinking about the biological conception of the Greek Albanian identity. There is such a thing. And it seems to me like it gives a trivial answer to that question. Is there a Greek Albanian identity? Yeah, of course. I mean, just look at the genes. But of course, I'm in philosophy, I'm in the social sciences, in the humanities, and we know better. We know not to speak about these identities in sort of such biological reductionist terms. But I still think it's important to consider this aspect, to consider this sort of genetic similarity between two peoples, and the sort of historical admixture and the cultural admixture and all of the affinities, the shared history that this implies, and especially how that can create certain kinds of invisibility or visibility. I would say it creates a lot of invisibility, and you'll see why I think that. But I want to stress and emphasize this aspect of visibility because I care about it very deeply, since it can allow us to draw nice parallels between this particular group of people, the Albanians of Greece, and other marginalized groups in Greece, of course, but also across the world, such as the LGBT community, who have suffered, a lot through the years, and have struggled with issues of visibility a lot because it's sort of relatively easy to just stay in the closet, just as it is relatively easy for Albanians, due to their sort of similarities with Greeks, to try to pass, as you said, and even hide their Albanianness. So I care about this issue a lot. And I think we can be helped by other identities that have faced, visibility issues throughout the decades. So I'll start right away in my philosophical way, just by stating my thesis. I want to argue that there is a rudimentary, as I said, form of Greek Albanian identity, which has been largely hampered, I believe, by invisibility. And I want to cautiously prescribe that it should not stay that way, that we should develop an even more robust Greek Albanian identity. And one way to achieve that robustness is by increasing visibility, or at least by decreasing whatever factors have led to the current invisible or broadly invisible status quo of Greek Albanians. Before I go on, I want to bring up some distinctions that I think will be helpful throughout the discussion, but I will just put them aside. And the first one has to do with the types of Greek Albanians that one can think of. I want to distinguish the Greek Albanian identity from Albanians who live in Greece, the sort of first generation Albanians, our parents, who would not, I believe, identify as Greek Albanians in any sense, unlike us, the second generation people. And I want to distinguish those from Greeks who live in Albania. Those count as Greek Albanians in another sense. I don't know if they're going to be a relevant group in our discussion. And also repatriated Albanians, that is, Albanians who came to Greece, lived there for maybe a decade or two, and then went back to Albania. And I will also mention something about Greek Albanians who, of our generation, second generation Albanians in Greece, who left Greece and moved to other primarily Western countries. So I also want to distinguish the diagnostic question. Is there a Greek Albanian identity from the prescriptive dimension of all of this? And I want to really try to keep them separate because that's useful and important. The prescriptive dimension being the question of whether there should be such an identity, such a Greek Albanian identity, whether it serves any purpose, whether there's an inherent goodness or badness to that. And I want to refrain from any blame attributions. I don't want to start blaming Greeks or Albanians for anything. I'm just going to try to do very diagnostic sort of remarks throughout this talk. And finally, I want to call attention to a fourfold distinction between separation, assimilation, integration, and marginalization. It's important to have those things separate in mind. And very quickly, I want to define separation as a high cultural maintenance phenomenon with very little integration, very little contact with the other culture. Assimilation would be something like very little cultural maintenance by a group and a lot of contact with the home culture. Integration, sort of the ideal in a multicultural society, scores very high on both. So there is a lot of cultural maintenance from within an immigrant group, but also a very high level of contact with the sort of home country. And finally, marginalization, that scores very low on both of those fronts. Okay, next, the other bit of my introduction, this is, I'm going to go through this very quickly and in passing. This is obviously a huge topic, but I do want to mention why I think that there is a rudimentary Greek Albanian identity already. It's not robust, it's not fully fledged, but I think there is something there. And the reason why I think has to do with all of these constitutive elements of a cultural identity, which are language. I think they're very interesting linguistic phenomena there, and I can say more later on if you'd like me to, that show that there's something going on there. There is a genesis of an identity. There's a broader culture. I think it's not very well developed still, but there are people, especially writers, who do explore themes of Greek Albanianness specifically, like Christos Armando Gezo, Suela Duxi, Gazman Kaplani, myself a little bit. I have written in my poetry things that are relevant to this topic, but also there's a broader culture of artistic, or rather broader artistic endeavor to explore this phenomenon. So there is a lot of attention from the broader culture. There's a common history as well. It's not long enough, however, but we all share a lot of, we all share a certain pattern in our historical development within Greece. Oppression is another element typically of a marginalized identity, and I think there is a little bit of that, even though I am a bit less pessimistic than Regina was when it comes to the degree of oppression that Albanians have suffered in Greece, considering how much worse it has been historically for other groups of people in other types of societies. There isn't a consciousness. I don't think that among us, second generation Albanians, there is a consciousness of feeling Greek Albanian. I don't think there is such a thing. And of course, there are no essential features. There's nothing about skin or religion or sexual orientation or anything like that could account for a sui generis identity. And finally, the jury's out when it comes to lived experience. I don't know what to say about that. So I want to explore the aspect of invisibility from both sides. I want to talk about the invisibility of Greek Albanians to Greeks, and then I'm going to talk about that invisibility to Albanians. But let me start with the Greeks. So literally there has been a lot of invisibility, primarily for historical reasons, because even though the immigration of Albanians into Greece was en masse, it was never really massive. I mean, this is a relative judgment, of course, but I don't think that there was a huge influx of Albanian immigrants into Greece, and that may have contributed a little bit to the invisibility. The other has to do with the broader historical context, with the fact that the two nations have never really been at war with each other. They've coexisted peacefully, relatively peacefully anyway, under Ottoman rule and in modern days. And Albanians never really wore, as I was just saying, actually, their difference on their sleeve. We have a white complexion, we don't have religious attire or jewelry, we have very many cultural similarities with Greeks. So that is another reason why you might think that there has been a lot of invisibility to Greeks. The other has to do with the psychological aspect of us ourselves and our parents' generation showing no resistance, even eagerness very often to blend in. I have a similar story about changing my name. Actually, my name was changed by my teacher in primary school into Renos. My best friends know me as Renos. I was baptized later on, Irineos. And of course, there have been a lot of acts, sort of more deliberate, active acts of exclusion and assimilation of Albanians by sort of being blind to them in certain ways. I have some examples, but I'll just move on in the interest of time. I should mention an aside here. Whenever I think about this issue, or whenever I bring this issue up in the US context, people frequently cite two common approaches to multiculturalism: a US or Brazil style melting pot approach, where all the different cultures and ethnicities sort of blend together to create a bigger whole and entity at least in the long run, versus a Canadian-style mosaic approach, where each group maintains sort of their culture in a distinct way. And I want to say that Greece has followed neither. It seems to me like Greece has been largely hegemonic and assimilationist in the way they've approached Albanian immigrants. And yeah, I can say more about that, but I think it stems from a self-image of Greece as a nation state, and a very chauvinistic one at that. I have here a little survey that sort of made the rounds on the internet maybe a year ago about how Greeks perceive themselves and their culture as superior to other cultures. Okay, let me say a few more things about the invisibility to Albanians, the invisibility of Greek Albanians to Albanians themselves. And here I have split that into different levels. The first one has to do with the national or international level, with Albania itself as a sort of political entity, as a country. And I want to say that Albania has made no attempts to lure back Greek Albanians. We were sort of invisible to them, as far as I can tell. At least maybe you all have different experiences with that, but this has been my impression. And I think this comes down to Albanians' own nationalistic tendencies and sort of lingering post-communist identity crisis. But also, there's the generational level at which I locate our parents, the first generation Albanian immigrants, who clearly identify as Albanian. They would never identify as Greek Albanians, and that has contributed to the invisibility of the group I'm interested in. And of course, at the individual sort of psychological level, I think there exists a pervasive fit-in mentality among us, and that can be attributed to the lack of consciousness and camaraderie and solidarity. I've never felt any sort of activism on our part in favor of a Greek Albanian identity, or the interests of a Greek Albanian identity. And that also has to do with the smoothness of our assimilation. Again, the religious, linguistic identity of Greek, of Albanians, made it extremely easy for us to sort of try to pass and sort of stay invisible within Greek society. And I would even go so far as saying that second generation Albanians are culturally Greek. I mean, you can tell that in many ways. Often I can tell that a Greek Albanian is culturally Greek just by the way they pronounce the S. In English, it's this sort of retracted S. And even the music that we listen to, I challenge you all to share the top 10 songs that you listen to, other than English language songs, that most likely going to be Greek, not Albanian. But I do grant that there's a lot of territory here for very interesting empirical work on this consciousness aspect. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the Greeks. The Greek Albanians who live abroad. I'm going to touch a little bit on the normative dimension and give my take on that. I'm sort of on the fence on this issue. I think there are some pros to trying to develop a robust Greek Albanian identity, but there are also some cons that I worry about. So I'm not sure. I tend to favor the pros side, but I want to register my sort of caution. So the pros obviously are, the possible reduction in racism by tempering perceptions of otherness, the advance of group interests, and the citizenship issue. I'm sure is an issue that we all struggled with at some point. But also I think that there will be very nice, broader sort of consequences if we try to push for a more robust Greek Albanian identity, in that we will contribute just a little bit to the diversification of Greek society and foster a spirit of cosmopolitanism, which might in turn improve attitudes towards other immigrant groups. On the cons, I'm afraid this will or might undo the existing assimilation that we've achieved, and that by itself is, has some positives, obviously. And we might also deepen cultural divides and and create some identitarian politics. Trouble is, of the kind that we see in the US. So I do worry about that. I also have some intersectionality concerns. I'm afraid that if we develop a robustly and genuinely Greek Albanian identity, we're going to sort of maintain and even pronounce aspects of the two cultures that are common, such as the machismo and the homophobia. And, as a queer person myself, I really care about whether, the development of such an identity might obscure subgroups within Greek Albanians, such as LGBT people. Okay, so how to, I don't know. Here it gets very obscure and difficult. I'm sort of, I don't have anything illuminating to say about how to develop a more robust identity. That's not a philosophical question, but I'm sure that solidarity with the current immigrant groups and movements might be of some help, and work in consciousness raising and art obviously might be some avenues to achieve the kind of robustness, but also the visibility that comes with that. Okay, so I'll stop here. Thank you very much for listening. And sorry, I went a little bit over time.
Thank you so much, Enno, for your very interesting and powerful contribution. So I would like to welcome our next guest, who is Neritan Zingiria. And yes. So Neritan is a Greek Albanian filmmaker. He was born in Tirana, but grew up in Athens. He created his first short film, The Best Bride, at the age of 18. And 4 years later, he won all major Greek film festivals with his second short film, Chamomile. Chamomile was also suggested by Cine Europa as one of the most important short films of 2013. In 2018, he won the Artworks Excellence Award by Stavros Niarchos Foundation, and his films have been screened in more than 200 film festivals in the world. Neritan, I hope you hear us, and we would like to welcome you.
Hello, hello. So it's actually great being among you guys. It's really interesting to hear thoughts and to see all the readings that someone might do on the identity. And well, yeah, I was born in 1989 in Tirana, Albania, and the year later I immigrated with my family to Greece. And up until 1997, I never asked myself about identity. I never thought of myself being Greek or Albanian. I was mixing up languages. I was talking with some Albanian words because my entire social experience was Greek. I was talking mainly Greek, but everyone could understand. It was up until 1997 when I remember my teacher in school coming in the class with the two new kids, which was, I still remember the names. It was Elvis and Rigers. So she was really joyful, and she said, let's actually show our greatest of hospitality to the new kids, and let's them show our class, and let's be patient because they don't speak the language, don't speak Greek, so they need to learn the language. So the bell rings, and I remember that we all gathered to play, and yeah, the kids didn't speak a single Greek word, but at the same time, I could understand them, but I could see that the rest of the classroom couldn't understand them. So it was that point that I didn't blame it to my superhero abilities. It was that moment when I said to myself that I guess I am somewhere in between. I mean, why am I understanding them and not anyone else does? So I guess when I go back, this was the main route of me trying to communicate with the world, trying to find a way to find a medium that works as a bridge. So this was the very first time that I said that I am actually in between. So I don't remember much my parents. I grew up with my grandmother, who was Albanian, a really noble figure, and she had suffered much in her life. My parents were working much, so I remember them only for good night. And also with my godmother, who was Greek and was a really legendary figure, like a monumental tower of my education. So those two figures kind of put me, I mean, they created a form of my mindset to trying to find the best way to express myself. And I started being really competitive, and I started trying to be the best student, the best on anything I could compete. So I know that there is most likely a reading that says that the second Greek generation or the third generation of immigrants have this tendency to try to top up. But I just took it from my from my background. And being, I guess, whenever they ask me, because it's been a while since people asked me what am I. Whenever they ask me, I never was one of the kids that had identity crisis. To me, it was really simple because it was a fact. I didn't choose to be something. I was Greek Albanian or Albanian-Greek by the simple facts. But if I want to speak more metaphorically, I guess I would say that I identify myself with everything that I like, everything that I love. I mean, being able to speak Greek and being able to speak also Albanian, which both languages are really important and they both lead into really beautiful stories. Somehow they put you in a place where you can engage into a richer world, which basically is really important to what I do. So whenever I want to feel inspired, or whenever I want to either relax and entertain myself, I always turn to the tradition that we share, which more or less is common. So to me, the matter of identity is more, it usually connects to a sense of coexistence. And it's really interesting because I never felt discriminated, but I guess it doesn't really matter because 90s to millennium, it was a general feeling. It was the momentum where the Greek media was affecting much the society. Well, the Greek TV was copying the Italian TV, and it was this sense of being really sexist or being really mean with mean jokes toward anyone who didn't fit the right profile, the profile that the society was accepting. So despite that, I can be only optimistic that because I can see people being more and more generous, and the fact that things and thoughts are shared, it links all the way back to my school story. Whenever you can, whenever you have the mood, or whenever you are keen to share and to communicate, I guess beautiful things start. So that's all from me. I'm actually thrilled to listen to the other speakers. So thank you much.
Thank you so much, Naritan. Just before we move on to the next panelist, I will just like to remind the audience who sort of like has joined later the live stream that you're watching the roundtable 30 years later, Rethinking Albanian-Greek Identity, right, where we're problematizing and challenging this idea of Albanian-Greek identity. We reimagine it, right, and we sort of like rethink one. So now I would like to introduce our next panelist, Ilira Aliaj. Ilira was born in Albania and grew up in Athens, where her family immigrated in 1997. She studied German language and literature in Athens and Berlin and completed her master's in cultural management. She worked for a decade in the field of education and youth work in Greece. Scholarship in the German Bundestag brought her back to Berlin in 2015, where she worked for the German Deputy Minister of Education and Science. Since 2016, she has been serving as an education expert in the German-Israeli Youth Exchange. There, she directs projects in the fields of diversity, education against anti-Semitism and historical civil education in both countries. Ilira is particularly interested in human encounters as a tool against discrimination and xenophobia. She divides her life between 4 countries, but feels lucky that her journey started in Albania. Ilira.
Thank you very much, Regina. Hello, everyone. Kalispera, Mirëmbrëma, të gjithëve. I'm very thankful to have the opportunity to talk in this round, and I'm also fascinated from what has already been said before from the previous speakers. It's really interesting, and I had for several moments this idea of, wow, not only have I heard this before, but I have felt this previously before in a very biographical sense. Like I had the impression in many things that were spoken about that I have, that I can fully relate to the experience. In those 10 minutes, I would like to simply tackle 3 points that are important to me if we want to talk about Albanian-Greek identities, as was suggested by the event and in which role we were invited to participate here, with a suggestion that probably there is something as such. In the first part, I will talk a little bit about my generation and also my biography. In the second part, I would like to tackle shortly the role of the majority society, of the Greek society in this conversation. And on the third part, I would like to refer to the long-term implications. Where do we see ourselves in this kind of topic in the future? Regina, you already introduced me. Thank you very much for that. So yeah, I was born in Albania, and I am one of the second generation Albanian immigrants in Greece. I belong to the stream of 1997. There were these waves, 91, 97, and later on. So I belong to the 97 one. And that makes a difference. I think that tells a story by itself, because it's the transition of families that come from a place of turmoil en masse, moving to Greece, to a place that has already had 6 years of experience with Albanian immigration there. And the first decade has been a particularly challenging one. The colleagues, Linda and Regina, you referred to it in your opening statement, so I'm not going to refer too much on that. On a personal level, growing up as a youngster, an 11 years old Albanian in Greece, that meant certain things. At first, I had, I can say I had a childhood, privileged childhood like everyone has, growing up in Athens, going to school, having the opportunity to, I don't know, go to Frontisterio, learn foreign languages, be quite good at school. So yeah, it's a quite regular childhood with all the experience that one makes in that age. But at the same time, there were certain experiences that showed me from a very, very young age that there is something here that is different about me, meaning I come from Albania. And because of my name, because of the name Ilira, which is quite foreign in Greece, the first question that was being raised to me was, where are you from? And this was something that I had to learn how to deal with it from very early on. And it forced me to kind of out myself from the beginning. Nowadays, I perceive it as a very lucky experience. Why? Because I could out myself, and I very consciously use the term outing, because it was quite a challenging experience being an Albanian in that time in Greece. So I am quite happy nowadays to know that I had the opportunity to out myself from the beginning, out there, I'm Albanian, this is my identity, and I could deal with it. Because I grew up in a generation of people who did not talk about their identity. I grew up in a generation of Albanians, which I happen to be classmates at school, who did not tell the rest of the students where they come from. Me coming from Saranda, from the very south of Albania, we come also from communities where we have Christian names, Christian sounding last names. So many people, including half of my family who has quite a Greek last name, they never spoke about their identity. So they created a sort of silence around them. Eno spoke wonderfully about this invisibility, but also they hid their identity. They created a sort of double identity, indeed, because everyone knows that you kind of speak another language in the house and another language in the public, so you know about it. But there is kind of this mysticism around it, and there is this kind of secrecy, which does something with you. And this has been my experience in that generation. So it was a generation where being an Albanian was quite a taboo. And Regina, I had goosebumps when you told your story, because it's identical to mine. I studied German language and literature, so my first job was going to a school and work, and my very first day, I was told as well from the principal not to tell the kids that I'm from Albania, which I silently accepted. And I have to tell you here that it's the first time that I say that I silently accepted, because the way I told the story later on to my friends and family is that I resisted, but I did not resist. I can tell today in 2021, actually, that I kept silent in order to keep my job. So this is just a fragment of what it meant back then, let's say, to be an Albanian who has just finished their degree, want to study further, want to work in education, want to continue their life just like anyone in the age of 20. Obviously, growing up as youngsters of Albanian descent in Greece, we could not but be something which included elements of culture from both languages, even from both countries. Both languages were present in my family, at least. We were kind of living between the two countries, or we had this kind of perception that yes, we know we were born elsewhere and we now live elsewhere. And we like it or not, this is how we were brought up. I mean, come on, a week ago or a few days ago, we had a meeting, the four of us, Regina, Linda, me, and Ervin, and we spoke Greek among each other. You know, it came so naturally to us. Everybody just started speaking in Greek. And in the future, if we'll have kids, most likely, I assume we'll be speaking Greek to our kids, I guess. I don't know, it's a personal choice, but a very challenging one. And so, of course, we identify as Albanian Greeks in the sense that, of course, we know where we came from, and of course, we know where we lived or where we live. At the same time, I have to say that we are experiencing a new generation nowadays that cannot tell the same story as I can say it here, because I could do this lecture here in Greek, English, or in Albanian, and I wouldn't blink twice. It wouldn't make any difference for me. Nowadays, there is a generation that cannot tell the same story the same way that I am saying it today. I worked for 10 years in education in Greece, and I have encountered lots of kids of the so-called, let's say, third generation, and they grow up solely as Greeks. They do not have any relation to Albania. They don't speak a word of Albanian. In many families, it's quite a taboo, mostly in those kind of Christian oriented families that are really struggling to belong and to tell themselves that they are more integrated than necessary, maybe. And so my question here is, how do we understand Albanian Greek identity? Because the way I see it now, we understand it as something that started in 91 and kind of ends here. So is Albanian Greek identity a fragment? Is it a historic fragment? Or more provocatively said, is it a historic accident that just happened by chance in our generation? Or is it something that has a continuity? Because if the generation nowadays grows up coming from Albanian families, but not relating, not by language, not by references with the other country, not by interest about the other country, namely Albania, then I don't know how can we even talk about this Albanian Greek identity. So I think that we are actually talking about a historic fragment, and lucky us, we're talking about it, but will there be in 30 years a panel such as this one with 4 or 5 panelists of Albanian descent having this very conversation? I am not sure. I'm really not sure about it. And the second point has to do with the majority society. It has to do with everyone, but I want to kind of irritate something in our minds in terms of who do we put the task of thinking about this fluid, hyphenated identity, multicultural identity, and so on. Whose task is this identity? Because if we talk about Albanian Greek identities, which you called us here to talk about this identity, then I honestly expect that we can be we are able to talk also about Greek Albanian identity. And what do I mean by that? I will refer myself, for the sake of understanding each other now in terms of communication, as an Albanian Greek, born in Albania, raised up in Greece. What happens to the majority society? Me living for 20 years in Greece, I know exactly what happened to me. I went through a process. I was born as an Albanian. I lived as a Greek. I kind of navigated through different experiences and different emotions in this identity. I want to ask you all who are not born in Albania and are here in this panel or are looking at us or hearing us, what happens to the majority society by the fact of this identity? Is there anything that has changed in the majority society because of my presence? And I can only suggest a few things that could change, for instance, by the fact that I exist for 30, my people, let's say, 500,000 Albanians in Greece exist there for 30 years already. One possibility is that you, as majority society, learned Albanian as a second, third, fourth foreign language. You integrate Albanian language at school. There is some effort to speak Albanian, to learn it, to know how to pronounce our names, to kind of, I don't know, even be able to greet me in the morning in my mother tongue. Question mark. How many of our people in our audience would know how to greet me in my mother tongue in the morning? A second thing that could have changed is being particularly interested about Albania, such as visiting the other country, such as having Albania as one of the first destinations that Greeks have for their, I don't know, Christmas vacation. Is that the case? Question mark. How many of you have been to Albania? How many of you know something about the country? How many of you have particular interest about the other country? 3, what could happen by our presence after 30 years could be that the majority society has become particularly sensitive, aware, educated in terms of diversity, awareness about otherness, awareness about migration policies. It's a lot more welcoming towards our other minorities. Again, question mark, has this been the case? So I just put 3 very simple examples of what I would expect to have happened in the majority society, so that I, as from the perspective of the minority in this point, can say that multicultural, fluid, hyphenated identities are not just a task for immigrants. They are a task for everyone who participates and is part of the society. I know it can sound like I'm asking too much, and of course there are power relations in every society, and majority and minority plays a role. But if we have the impression, and I do personally have sometimes the impression, that Albanians have learned everything that there is to learn about Greece, but Greek people still know very, very little about Albania, then something has been damaged in the way we perceive this dual identity. Then I struggle to identify with what you are suggesting me, this kind of Albanian-Greek identity. And another thing that I wanted to refer to is the possibility that these identities have. I mean, the place where we were born, our national identity, if we want to call it like that, it matters. It does something to us. So we cannot simply say, oh, kind of get over your identity, it doesn't mean anything, you're a citizen of the world and so on. But it would be absurd to say, let's say to a person of color, get over your color. I don't see any colors, you know, it would be totally, we would never accept such a sentence. Or in a group of women, we would never accept someone who does not identify as a woman to tell a woman, get over the fact that your gender is this and that, okay? So identity matters. What we have experienced as Albanians growing up in Greece has left a mark on us. And because it was said before in a sentence that the subjects themselves don't feel bad about themselves, I am not so sure about that. We are in a very critical historic period where we have to start examining what has happened to my generation, to our generation, who came in an early age to Greece and are growing up now. Because there are a lot of studies from other countries showing the long-term implications of it having experienced otherness in such a way. The fact that I was born that I lived in Greece as an Albanian Greek has left a mark on me that only now has started to show its long-term implications. And there are many, many studies showing, also in psychoanalysis, that show that children of migrant parents suffer from a particular stress that is found in these people. So yes, the subjects do experience something, and long term we can say as much as we want, yes, I didn't experience discrimination, my life was good. Of course, we lived in a functional country, in a democratic country, our lives were fine. But from the microaggressions to the systemic exclusion, both me and Regina apparently couldn't teach. I mean, in the age of 20, you want to do one thing, open your wings and kind of start to fly. And the system, the state tells you, you cannot because you are not born here. So take your paper that you just got from your fancy university and throw it in the garbage. This leaves a mark on you. And on that moment, trying to protect yourself from these emotions, you say, it's all right, nothing happened to me. But actually, if we all go through a process of reflection, and thankfully, I'm so thankful that I am right now in Berlin and have found here a community of Greek Albanian-Greek people who have been through exactly the same biography as me. And we find out that these things have done something to us. They have created, they have shaped our identity tremendously. And they have also created a little bit of an anxiety, you know, you hear it maybe in my voice. I cannot speak only academically about these things. I studied a lot on this field, so I can also do that. But there is something in there that doesn't let me distance myself completely from this experience, because it's been I think it's been the most shaping experience in my life, migration experience so far. So to conclude, also looking at the time, I wish to say that what I consider myself doesn't mean anything. It means nothing if I cannot address my experience to an audience, to an other who listens to this experience. It doesn't matter if I wake up in the morning and I say, I'm Greek and Albanian. It doesn't matter if I speak Greek and Albanian in my house, if the other person negates this identity, if they put a question mark on it. It simply doesn't make anything. We can live in our communities, in our little bubbles, and we are here as well in a very privileged circle where we can take this distance and talk kind of, you know, in an academic privileged level about these things. But there is a whole generation that I think needs to go through a healing process. And if we don't go through that healing process, I think that we cannot talk about this kind of identity. So as a closing word, I invite us and you all to reflect on your personal role, on my personal role of how can we help, if not the generation, our generation, the one that is growing up now as Albanian Greeks or Greek Albanians, call it however you want it, how can we help them go through this identity in peace, not in anxiety. So that's all from me for now.
Thank you so much, Ilira, for your insightful contribution. So our next guest is Ervin Kondaksiou, and I'd like to welcome him. So Ervin was born in Albania, in a small village of Albania, and grew up in Athens. He studied political science at the University of Athens. He did a master's on politics, economics, and philosophy at the University of Hamburg, where he started also his PhD and worked as a research associate, and he taught various courses in political and critical theory. Now he's continuing his PhD project at the University of Groningen and on a 2-year scholarship at the Faculty of Philosophy. His PhD dissertation revolves around the concept of disobedience politics from the perspective of critical theory. So I'm very much looking forward to hear on Ervin on what he has to say, because it happens that we studied on the same department in Athens and we used to mainly disagree. So I'm very curious to see where we stand on the question of identity.
Well, Hello, everyone, and many thanks to Regina and Linda for organizing this very timely and urgent event, and for inviting me, of course. That was a great pass, Linda, because I wanted to start by saying that I feared that the order of the presenters was not optimal, because I feared that I will take you now to the darker, or not to say darkest, side of the moon, both theoretically and politically, perhaps. But thankfully, there's always the discussion part that could redeem the whole thing. Let me share a small PowerPoint presentation that I prepared. Okay, I hope it's working now. So I will try to be as brief as possible and not exploit your kindness. And if I do, please bear with me, because I actually may end up using 1 or 2 minutes of extra or added time. And well, that's because, as it was apparent in the preceding presentations, the issue at hand is extremely complex, and my contribution is surely going to be schematic and elliptic, but hopefully with the assistance of the other time, not overly impressionistic. This is my outline for today. As you can see, I will first introduce some theoretical insights modified for the purposes of our topic, in order to build a scheme of analysis that can hopefully take us some way in the attempt to comprehend the phenomenon of migration from Albania to Greece the past 30 or so years from the viewpoint of identity formation. By combining ideas and arguments from the fields of nationalism studies and the so-called theory of recognition, I will try to provide some tentative answers to some of the questions at the core of today's event, which questions were raised by the organizers, and already the ones who spoke before me addressed them in one way or another. So the main 2 questions, the 2 main questions I want to touch upon is, first, the question: is there an Albanian-Greek identity, and why not if no, and how come if yes? And second, should such an identity exist at all? So going back to Anna's presentation, I also have a kind of diagnostic and normative or prescriptive part to present here. So let me then start with the central concept of the roundtable. It is rather self-evident that at the heart of any discussion about an Albanian-Greek identity lies the concept of the nation or nationness. Now, undeniably, all modern subjects are bearers of a multitude of identities. One may be a woman, a chemist, a homosexual, a connoisseur of punk music, a football enthusiast, and so on. National identities are only one of the many layers of modern self-consciousness. One very important one, nevertheless, which influences in various and significant ways the landscape of one's self-image. Let's then start with a classical definition of the nation. Benedict Anderson defines the nation as an imagined political community, and imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. It is imagined not in the sense that it consists in mere fiction and fabrication, but rather that any nation is the result of productive efforts to reconstruct and creatively interpret past and present characteristics of particular communities and demarcate their difference from other national communities. It is furthermore a community because it always appeals to some deep and horizontal relations of comradeship between its members. It appeals to a condition of equality among otherwise very unequally and hierarchically ordered subjects. Finally, it is limited because even the greatest in number nation has finite boundaries. Every national narrative must involve a dialectic between inclusion and exclusion. It must differentiate the ones belonging from the ones that do not belong. This dialectic varies greatly in degrees of elasticity, as I want to argue, and this is of particular importance for our purposes. Departing from this definition, I want to suggest that we can artificially and for analytical purposes distinguish between the axis of the symbolic and that of the material existence of a nation as a social relation. On the symbolic axis, we find a number of cultural artifacts, such as discourses, narratives, representations, images, and the like, that determine the self-understanding of the national community in question and, importantly, designate the necessary qualities of a member. Now, it is customary in the literature to distinguish such self-understandings into ethnic and civic. An ethnic conception designates members on the basis of birth by members. The property of national belonging is passed on by already belonging parents to their children, as if nationness were a property transmissible via genes, molecules, and what have you. On the contrary, the civic conception or a civic conception consists of members on the basis of birth on the national territory and participation in the cultural and political institutions. Now, to be sure, this ethnic civic distinction must not be understood, or actually must be understood as a spectrum. And because it is a spectrum, and in reality, all national self-understandings include elements of both. On the material axis of the existence of the nation, we find a bundle of duties and rights that concretize the content and meaning of citizenship as a relation between the state and its citizens. The citizens are expected to remain loyal to the institutional manifestation of their nation in the form of the state, and at the same time enjoy a number of rights which are granted to them by virtue of their belonging to the national community. Such rights that are characteristic of that define citizenship can be distinguished and have been distinguished actually in T.H. Marshall's classical distinction into civil, political, and social rights. Now, moving on, so far I have only thematized the first component of the concept of an Albanian-Greek identity, right? That the nation is involved in the concept. Now I want to turn our gaze to the second component. I want to ask, what is an identity, and where do identities come from? How are they formed, and what functions do they serve? To discuss this question, I will employ some insights from the so-called theory of recognition, and it is generally there's a consensus that all recognition theories depart from an insight to be found in the work of the German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. And according to him, humans are essentially social beings in the sense that their distinctive properties or capacities, such as freedom or autonomy, are determined in relation to the norms and values embedded in social practices and institutions of their particular communities. Now, to unpack this claim, the fundamental sociality of human beings entails that they only develop a sense of who they are in and through interaction with significant others. The way I therefore understand the concept of identity is nothing else than this practical relation to the self, or sense of the self, or account of who one is, as was apparent in the contributions preceding mine. Now, this account of who one is molded, maintained, or damaged by one's intercourse with others. And this is why the concept of recognition is of particular importance. What's more, given the dependency on others for capacities enabling identity formation, due recognition appears to be as a kind of vital human need. The crux of the idea that identities are formed through relations of recognition is that one can only form a particular sense of the self if the person in question is recognized by relevant others as possessing the traits, skills, and abilities associated with that particular conception. From this understanding of the intersubjective nature of identity formation, we can draw the conclusion that human beings are other dependent and vulnerable in fundamental ways. All forms of recognition and practical relations to the self embody a potential for harm and injustice, which could in turn initiate political change. And this is the positive note here. Now, why is this so, right? This is so because the experience of misrecognition or lack of recognition embodies an epistemic potential, the emotions of indignation, frustration, and despair associated with experiences of disrespect have the potential of disclosing the unjust and harmful nature of social practices and institutions. When such experiences acquire an epidemic character, social political struggles for recognition tend to emerge. Such social struggles aim at the interpretation of a society's, at the reinterpretation of a society's value horizon towards more inclusion, diversification, and equality. Now, to wrap up, identities are forms of practically relating to the self. They are formed through and in relations of intersubjective recognition, and they function as enabling or precluding conditions for certain behaviors, for the generation of self-worth, the exercise of agency and autonomy, and the building of meaning within the otherwise void and chaotic social environment that modernity consists in. With that being said, I can now move to the last and most controversial part of my contribution. Let me reformulate the two questions I would like to tentatively address in the light of the theoretical insights I just presented. First, is there an Albanian-Greek identity, and why not? If no, and how come if yes? Second, should such an identity exist at all? I will address each in turn. To begin with, whether such an identity exists is a question that best be left to empirical research. However, theory can help us articulate reasonable and informed hypotheses. My hypothesis then is that an Albanian-Greek identity does not exist, or to be more precise, it does not constitute a significant and/or hegemonic trend in the accounts of the self of the members of the social group in question. Now, this hypothesis stands on the following theoretical premises. First, from the perspective of the symbolic axis of the existence of the nation, and maintain that both the hegemonic Albanian and the hegemonic Greek national narratives are predominantly ethnic conceptions. Both narratives put at center stage arguments about national purity and bloodlines running from at least antiquity to present day. On top of that, both narratives treat each other as enemies, as territorial thieves and competitors. Thus, it seems to me that there is a great difficulty in combining these two identities. Second, from the perspective of the material axis of the existence of the nation, the experience of first, second, and third generation migrants is characterized to various degrees by exclusion, differential treatment, discrimination, exploitation, and invisibility, as Eno already argued. Now, to corroborate these claims, by reference to a few characteristic examples, think of the fact that the Greek state reduced the existence of first-generation migrants from Albania to a form of bare life. From the beginning of the 1990s to 1997, the Greek state refused to recognize even the physical presence of first-generation migrants by not offering any process of legalization or documentation. Think of the precarious and temporary permits of stay issued during the following 3 decades. Think of the differential treatment in hospitals, tax authorities, and the like, not to mention the police. Think of the absence of political rights, the discriminatory and the discriminatory attribution of social rights. Think of the immense obstacles put by the Greek state in front of the ones that wish to get the Greek citizenship, and so on. The Albanian state, on the other hand, treated this group of people, treated us as primarily a good source for generating revenues. Think of the countless fees migrant Albanian citizens were and are still obliged to pay for the issuance of the simplest of documents. Or think of the refusal of the Albanian state to simplify such procedures by not offering a great number of its services through its embassies and consulates in Greece, but requiring instead that migrants present themselves in person in Albania to the relevant authorities. Both the trip to Albania and the trip back to Greece implied not only time costs, but for the individuals in question, this requirement did not only force time costs on us, on the social group, but also forced us to pay countless bribes to exercise our rights, both to Albanian officials and to the Greek customs police. Third, if this is the historical reality and we depart from the insights of recognition theory, namely the idea that identity formation is mediated through intersubjective recognition by social practices, institutions, and relevant interlocutors, then to me at least, Albanian Greekness sounds as likely as a cold day in hell. Now, some of you there, I guess, Eno,
you need to be wrapping up.
Okay, sure. I will go as fast as I can. So you could point to me that actually there is such thing as an Albanian Greek identity, and we can observe it out there. And then the question that pops up is, oh, is theory wrong then? As you may guess, my answer is of course not. The contradictory and paradoxical social forces that migrants are exposed to give rise to contradictory and paradoxical constellations of identity. To elaborate somewhat, think of the following. On the one hand, migrants from Albania were constantly constructed as the essentially other, the ones that cannot belong. On the other hand, they were constantly pushed to hide their biographical origins, to erase their cultural, linguistic, and other traits, and assimilate upon arrival. On the one hand, as one of the most famous sons of the supporters of the Greek football national team goes, the Greek society and state were telling these people, were telling us, you will never become Greek, you Albanian, you Albanian. Δεν θα γίνεις Έλληνας ποτέ, Αλβανέ, Αλβανέ. On the other hand, as the very common practice of name changing, of Greekifying Albanian names shows, Greece was asking us to assimilate and annihilate difference. In this contradictory context, indeed, we may observe the appearance of an Albanian Greek identity. Now, I don't have time to go into depth into that. We can do so in the discussion part, but my hypothesis is that such an identity is positively associated with the experience of some kind of upward social mobility, and it constitutes a kind of expression of desire of belonging to the social environment that you live in. Now, my final remark, there is the other question whether such an identity should exist, right? So the honest answer from a theoretical perspective would be to say that such questions should be left to political agents on the ground. Now, however, what I think that theory can do is inform us with regard to the following questions. What would the politics sanctioned by the pursuit of an Albanian Greek identity look like? If the question was such, then it seems to me that a number of dangers, risks, and potentials for jeopardizing unintended consequences can be pointed. And I will skip some of the arguments I want to present here. So, but let me very briefly name the 4 kinds of hazards that I see in the pursuit of such a politics. First, just like any other form of identity politics, there is the risk of mere gesturism, of mere symbolic forms of affirmation that on the one hand do not achieve much in terms of concrete, substantial material social change, and on the other hand, legitimize hierarchies that are thus left untouched. To give an example, maybe a few excellent school students of Albanian background will now be welcome to carry the Greek flag during the national parades. This could, though, nurture the illusion of inclusion and inequality and conceal the fact that children of migrant background are excluded from education by a multiplicity of practices. Second, such a politics could end up both reproducing existing forms of exclusion and generating new ones. Now, let me very, very briefly just put the point through some questions, right? So, what does it mean to be a woman in Albanian Greek? Can you be queer in Albanian Greek? Can you be unemployed or unemployable in Albanian Greek? And so on. Third, the insistence on national identities for subjects that have repeatedly been disrespected and discriminated against and what have you on the basis of national divisions reproduces nationness as the essence of human life. Such a politics, on the one hand, reproduces and consolidates the essentialism of a socially constructed category, and on the other hand, it sounds a bit like the homeopathic nonsensical principle of like cures like, transplanted at the level of politics. Finally, part of the success of nationalism has to do with the inherent tendency it has to conceal conflictual and antagonistic relations by establishing homogeneity among otherwise very hierarchically ordered subjects. The nation is imagined as a conflict-free, harmonic unity, and thereby social relations of subjugation, exploitation, and the like go unnoticed. And the threat here is that progress never occurs. Final remark, and after drawing this green picture, it's going to be a positive one, as I have tried to show a politics centered around the pursuit of the concept of Albanian-Greek identity comes with significant drawbacks and involves great opportunity costs. Assuming that the theoretical insights I presented earlier are valid, we can say that being the other within a social formation, being the one for whom social practices and institutions not only do not work, but are thus designed as to inflict you harm and facilitate your submission and subjugation, has something potentially positive. The experience of disrespect on the basis of the world being organized around national divisions allows one to see the zombie without the fancy dress. Or at least there is such a structurally generated objective potential, I maintain. Excuse me for abusing your kindness, and thank you. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Erwin. This was wonderful. It really resonated with me, right? The exclusions that you talked about, right? And how we can think about this intersectionally. And also Lira, right? Talking about trauma essentially and healing from it. I find myself also trying to sort of asking those questions to myself. We'll be now opening up the Q&A for our Zoom attendants first. But I would like to make a request that we all sort of like keep our contributions, comments, or questions short. So those questions are welcome. And yeah, we can try turning on the cameras for all the panelists. We do have some questions from YouTube, but I would like to give the Zoom attendants the opportunity to go first. Okay. I don't see anything coming. Do you think, Linda, we want to start with some YouTube questions? Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, I see. Dimitra Gitsa has a question. Dimitra, do you want to go ahead and turn on your mic and camera?
Dimitra, we don't.
Hi, everyone. Okay. Sorry, it was taking some time to switch to a panelist. Thank you very, very much for organizing the panel and for this very insightful contribution. I think that I would just like to make a comment on the element of affect and personal narrative when we are discussing identity, because I think that this conversation here is very belated, right? So the element of listening to each other's experiences, memories, the very perhaps testimonies of living and growing up in that society is something that we didn't have the opportunity to do before, exactly because we lived and grew up in a society that had normalized racism. And I would like to acknowledge also the positionality that we have in making this conversation now, right? So we are not our parents, we are more educated than our parents, some of us are living abroad. We do have the platform to build up this conversation. And so I just wanted to point out the very importance of speaking up, of making the personal political. And it's something that only now we are starting to talk about. So listening to how the Albanian Greek identity can be alien and oppressive, I think it's quite sterile, because we need to speak up and we need to make this visible. But something that perhaps we need to consider is that this identity is not solid, is not one. It is hybrid, it is fluid, it is transforming as we are moving away from Greece or Albania, as we are growing up. So personally, whenever people were asking me, where are you from? I would never respond with the verb I am, ime. So the very identity, speaking about an identity without using the verb I am, but I would always use something like, I was born in Albania, I grew up in Greece, I'm living in London. And so we bear, I think, multiple identities. We are Albanian, we are Greeks, but then moving outside Greek, I realized that I'm also Balkan. I'm also European in a post-Brexit UK. So I just wanted to maybe from this comment and thoughts to extend the question about an identity that moves outside and beyond just nationality or citizenship, an identity that perhaps is in between, or it's shifting. So just a thought out there, and it has been wonderful to hear all these insightful talks.
Thank you, Dimitra. So I'm not going to address this question to sort of everybody in the panel, but I would ask that maybe one of you would like to address or comment on Dimitra. And I see you already, Edwin. You want to go ahead?
Well, in case there's no one else, and I mean, I think that it was a very interesting question, but also the remarks very interesting to me, because I think there was some kind of a dialogue between what I was saying and what Dimitra just said right now. So, in principle, I don't think it's Albanian Greek identity. There's nothing inherently wrong with it. But what I fear is that the dynamics between the concrete social conditions in which this identity could be implemented may lead to some kind of regressive unintended consequences. Now, what do I mean by this? I mean, what I feel, right? Let me put my cards on the table. The way Dimitra was talking about, this kind of non-national and not an identity that moves beyond nationality and citizenship, that sounds a lot like cosmopolitanism, right? And I understand that. I mean, there is something good in being a cosmopolitan, but what I fear is that being a cosmopolitan somehow has there are some kind of social preconditions for being a cosmopolitan. If you have experienced some kind of upward social mobility and you have come into contact with sort of more middle classes that are sort of more cosmopolitan and more liberal, it is easier for the subject to claim this identity, to live by this identity. But what I fear is that if we're to construct the Albanian Greek identity on these terms, then the ones left behind, the ones that have not experienced upward social mobility, would be left out. And what kind of, how easy will it be for them to be Albanian Greek? And how easy will it be for them to deal with their, relative non-successful biographies? Maybe, if they could make it, if this cosmopolitan Albanian Greek, if cosmopolitan Albanian Greeks, like all of us, let's be honest, in a way could make it, then why couldn't I make it? Maybe it was my personal responsibility. So these are the things that I fear. So that's why I prefer having this kind of identity very, very tied to structural relations, to citizenship, to rights, to this kind of things that can be distributed more or less equally, right? Like some kind of equal chances for steering the political institutions through which we can experience our collective existence and so on. So thank you.
So next, Petrus will speak, but I have a really small comment. And I was thinking that you addressed hierarchies and everything like is taking still place. But I'm also thinking that the nation state doesn't guarantee inequality as a member of it. Like we can still identify culturally as Greeks without being equal members, because even Greeks themselves, they are not equal, but they identify through other forms, and still this belonging takes place. And that's the huge success of the national identity. And let's go to Petro so I don't take all the space.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Linda, Regina, and all the panelists for this excellent event. I join in the praise that it was a wonderful, although sometimes painful, to hear the stories and experiences and trauma. And it invites a lot of us. I'm not of Albanian heritage myself, but I was of a very young age when I had the first Albanian classmates, and I remember a lot of the stigmatization, the visibilization, and all the stories. I just want to say I agree with what was said about this being a belated event, and it's great that these conversations are being had. My question is, how do we make these conversations wider and more known and more prominent in the societies that they are most relevant to? So how do we make these experiences known to broader audiences, broader narratives and discourses in Greece and Albania and elsewhere? And how do we make an impact in this way, perhaps by opening up to, including and representing people who are affected by these conditions, who may not be positioned in the way that we are, such that, as you know, we're on this platform, we converse in English, we're open to an international audience. So I agree that this should be, with the statement that personal should become political, but it should also become more societal. So how do we do this? Sorry for the big task. I know it's not an easy ask. So I'd love your thoughts on this. Thank you so much for this.
Elira, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Pedro, for the very important question. I will say the expected, and in the same time, it's not so expected because it's not happening as we're speaking. I mean, I'm an educator myself. I work in youth work, so this is the field I think we can contribute and where I have a few ideas. As we all know it in this group, Greeks, we are multilingual. We love foreign languages. We're like, I don't know, 1/4 of our family budget goes into Frontisteria, into learning foreign languages, and that's great. That's fantastic. I experience it also here when I meet Greeks. They converse in several languages. That's amazing. How about we, I don't know, just dropping it as an idea out there, kind of integrating Albanian, not only as this disastrous scenario we had in Hanya, where it was offered as a kind of, I don't know, in a human rights level, as a foreign language to Albanian kids to kind of learn their mother tongue, but for everybody, maybe once a week, once a month, I don't know. I think it could be an idea. The Albanian language being integrated as a part of education. Another one, because I come from the youth exchange field, I think that youth exchange can do wonders, and Greece is at the moment investing very, very much in youth exchange. There has been also like a youth office for German-Greek youth exchange since a few years, and there's also money going into this field, and it's great, it's fantastic. I support it fully and strongly because it has a strong, it can affect the lives of youngsters, but before going to Germany, go to your neighbor country. It really can make a very, very big impact. Have, you know, also those fantastic pendaimeres that we used to do, those trips that we flew to Rome or to Rhodes or to Paris or whatsoever. Go to Tirana. It's such a cool city, I promise. I mean, go 3 days instead of going to Kalamati, or you can also fly with the same money to Tirana. Just a simple idea. And biographic work. Biographic work is the A and Z when we work in education. We cannot just study books about each other. We need to tell our stories. And in education, this is such a simple thing to do. I believe and suggest that every person has a story to tell. Open the platforms wherever you are, at school, in education, wherever you work with youngsters, and ask them with the right questions to tell their story. And I can assure you the magic happens when you tell your story. A lot of good things happen. my very small 2 cents on this.
Yes, I know. Go ahead.
I just have a quick comment. I think Elira did an excellent job at giving you some examples and specifics. My very simple-minded answer would be that you do whatever you do for any other marginalized group when you want to create some inclusion and recognition. I don't see that the strategies for Greek Albanian visibility would have to be any different than for any other oppressed or marginalized or minority group. So yeah, in some ways we already have the answers.
There is a burning comment here that I have to share. Of course, you do what you have to do with all other groups, and you educate. If we are talking Greek society, you educate Greek society to do that. Elira brilliantly, and all of you shared how it is not done for any group in Greece, and that the work is constant. And because it is constant, it has to be happening constantly, being revised constantly, and in that kind of effective way, actually, that we all spoke, also address the issues that are there. A big part of our co-citizens, if we talk about Greece, identify as Albanian-Greeks. Other citizens identify as having Greek Arvanite, that is, Greek Albanian, let's face it, tradition. We already have a comment online from Neni Panouria, who has written one of the most beautiful books on living as an Arvanite, that is, with an Arvanite tradition in Greece. And I also identify as that. The tradition is there. Albanian Greekness is there already. And of course, in saying that, I'm not claiming any kind of experience like the ones we heard. What is also there is, immigrant identities, immigrant experiences, new citizenships that we need to discuss. And how do we do that? We are talking about rethinking the curriculum. And this is a discussion that needs to happen also with what has been said in mind. I find it personally extremely appalling that Greek schools do not offer Albanian. As Elira said, not just as a kindness gesture for Albanian kids, as a language that's important in order for everything that we have had to happen, but also in order to heal. And mind you, it would also be a beautiful return also to rethinking issues of other languages spoken in the Greek space. And for this reason, I think that such discussions are important, but also a forceful conversation to say, no, you don't do what you do about all groups, of course. And you also actively participate in a citizenship dialogue that brings these questions to the fore, to the center of the classroom. And I have to say, the intersections that appeared today of gender, of sexuality, were also important, because you do that also with those intersections. And humbly I say, I'm elated, I'm humbled by what we've heard, but also deeply moved. Thank you.
Neridan, do you want to comment very briefly so that we have sort of like questions piling up?
Just really briefly to say to Dimitris that it's not exactly right to expect that all identities around are crystal clear. I mean, every identity is connected to a persona, and every persona has its own roots, and sometimes he chooses to highlight really specific elements from the family's past that are connected to him. But I've been toured around the Balkans much because of my work, and I could say that, for example, when I was in Romania, because I lived in Romania for like 3 to 4 years, my inner geography got immediately affected by the society structure, and it was I mean, it was the first time that I came close to Albania, although I wasn't in Albania, because I started discovering my second homeland later on. So I would kind of bring again what Dimitra Gitsa said brilliantly. It's a fluid issue. And sometimes you need to be distant. You need to have the right distance, at least, to actually talk about it. So it's not this kind of crystal clear that, let's say, that's Albanian. No, it's not. And at the same time, how can you possibly say that I'm not Greek Albanian? And that why should I be so afraid that this might vanish? So what? I mean, we might be the bridge and it might not vanish. And yes, I traveled much to Tirana, for example. It's really beautiful. And a week ago, I saw a Life article, which is like the super duper hipsterish portal that I wasn't expecting, but I saw a really long article about Albania and Tirana. So things change and we're present. Some of us were present also in more difficult times, but at the same time, the reading that things are not going to get better, I don't think it brings any kind of justice to this panel, because we are making it better in the sense we are sharing, we are communicating, we are actually speaking up, and we have all brilliant stories to tell. Obviously, there is trauma. Obviously, there are difficult things that we been through. I mean, most likely all of our parents walk the distance by foot. So this is something really strong that it's imprinted in our memory. But let's use memory as our main tool to redefine our collective memory. So let's not be this strict about identities, because it's really sensitive. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Naritan. I think Lady Bilali has a question. Lady, do you want to turn on your camera and mic?
Hello. I would like to congratulate the panel and all the speakers. It was really inspiring for me. The very words every speaker chose was with a magical way that made me reintroduce to my hybrid identity. So I find it really magical. I don't want to say a lot of things. I think it was more than adequate to what everybody said. But I just want to make a comment. I think that this torch was ignited tonight for me specifically. They made me realize some aspects that I had not taken into consideration. And for me, the next step, what Petro said earlier, would be in the challenge from the no space of internet, this torch to arrive with continuity to space, to Greece. And I think the ground is really fertile. There are people here that want to make these initiations, and it will be very, very beautiful to see these actions here in Greece too. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lady. That's a great analogy with the torch, and very fitting of our event. So we also have a question in the Q&A by Brian Joseph. I'm gonna read it out loud to the panelists, and maybe one of you decides they want to address it. So some of you spoke of experiences in countries other than Greece. There are commonalities to be sure, but do you think these are universals of human interaction, perhaps unfortunate ones?
I just need some clarification. What does the person mean by these? Is he or she talking about the experiences, whether the experiences we've had abroad, or about the experiences we've had in Greece? It's a little unclear to me.
The experience is sort of like my understanding of it, and Brian can clarify if you want. The experiences we've had in Greece sort of like being common in other places where we've lived in. Yeah, Elira?
Only if I'm not taking someone else's time and space, but okay. I think it's not by chance that, let's count me, Eno, Regina, Linda, Erwin, Ritan, I'm not sure, Dimitra for sure. the majority of the people who spoke live right now abroad. That could be by chance, but I believe it's not by chance. Now, I moved to Germany 6 years ago, 6 years and a half, and I work in diversity education in the German-Israeli Youth Exchange. I can certainly say that societies go through migration, through discovering otherness, through discovering communities, minorities, majorities, and so on, in the same patterns. We are all made out of the same components, and we experience otherness more or less in the same time. But the level of otherness does make a difference. Not in order for us to go to competitive victimhood, who's had it better, who's had it worse. But I believe that people who are in this room would not have the same biographies to refer to had we continued to live in Greece. Not in terms of what we do in our jobs, not in terms of success, not in terms of how high or low the ceiling is for us. Personally, I can say that when I came here, it was only then, and I was very vocal in Greece already, but it was only then that I realized what I have gone through. I don't want to debate on what it is that I've gone through, but it was only later that I got this distance, that I was able to reflect on my biography. And I was able to understand, and I found many people having experienced the same, that the way I perceived it, the oppression, the negation of my own identity, the stress that I went through was something that people here, because I work in this field, could not exactly relate to. Migrant people who grew up in Greece, who grew up in Germany, they could relate because the structures are the same, but the intensity, it was something that they failed to understand. This is my personal experience. And I believe that we have been the lucky generation that has gone through this crazy wave. I think the generation today has another story to tell in Greece, but I believe the intensity has been different for us growing up in Greece, and that does matter. That does make a difference, even though, of course, as I said, the structures are more or less the same. Humanity works in the same kind of way. But no, not every country is the same racist. Not every country is the same inclusive or exclusive. Not every country is the same accepting or not accepting of minorities. This is a fact. It's statistics can speak for it. And I think we need to keep it in mind. There are better models, and we need to strive for the better models. There are so many countries that are doing so much better. Greece has a lot to learn in that sense.
Thank you, Lira. Anna, did you want to comment?
I had a quick comment, but we can move on if we're in a time.
You can give your quick comment then.
I just wanted to convey my personal experience here in the US. And I do feel the need to say that when it comes to ethnicity, I felt not only a lack of racism, but almost a fascination by Americans about, my Greek identity, my Albanian identity. It seems to me like people are genuinely curious. They're, of course, very welcoming, which is not to say that the American society isn't racist. It is, but the racism is sort of structured along, racial lines or in a very different way. And I have not experienced the same kind of racism or any racism at all, even though I like to say sometimes provocatively here in the US context that I'm not white. When people ask me about my race, I tell them that I'm not white because whiteness in America means a very specific thing. And I, as an Albanian who grew up in Greece, have never experienced the benefits that whiteness is sort of supposed to be essentially intertwined with. So I like to provoke people that way sometimes.
Thank you, Anna. So I think Dimitris is gonna read some comments from YouTube. We have plenty. I don't know if we'll be able to address all of them, but maybe Dimitri can offer sort of those intriguing ones.
Our colleagues from Torch have kindly given us until 1:15. So this is pretty much the shape of the discussion. as we have it in terms of time. And sorry, for before if I jumped a little bit on your statement. I thought you were concluding the pressures of organizing. So there has been a lot of brilliant comments and questions on the chat. They will stay there for those of you who are gonna watch this later on. I'm gonna share in two groups the questions, and then if co-panelists want to address them, I'll return for some more. So there is a question that brings to us the specter of well-known Albanian Greeks. Ridvaldimo says, can someone of the panel says if there is any influential or political personality yet that claim, and that I think is an interesting question that also speaks to what all of you and Ilira in particular have been saying. There is a very beautiful question about music also, and whereas new trends of popular music can become or are a platform for other forms of identity, including Albanian Greek identity, to be visible or not, and what are your views? There's a similar question from Billy Mitsikakos, who asks about the intersection of queer and Greek. Some of you have already mentioned them, and I would add of queer and Albanian Greek. And there is a question. I wanted to conclude this first part of reading out questions from the internet by Marlena Nika. And I am gonna read it word for word. She says, I was wondering if the panelists could further discuss on the invisibility of Albanians and the invisibility of the violence against them in Greek society, which I see not being so much mentioned in this panel. So that was the first part of comments from the internet.
Would somebody like to address any of the comments, questions? You don't have to address all of them, certainly. Anna?
So I just wanted to speak a little bit more about the sort of the intersection of queer and Greek Albanian identities that's near and dear to my heart. And I want to say that I first sort of became conscious of that intersection when I watched the film Xenia, I think is the title, where one of the protagonists is a gay Albanian teenager. And that sort of resonated to me so much because it made me realize that as Ilira was saying, being a gay Greek Albanian, you sort of have to do two outings very often, and this can really, really box you in and really shape you, for the rest of your life. So this is a very difficult process to navigate, and I don't have anything illuminating to say about that other than the fact that I worry that if we reinforce a sort of Greek Albanian identity, we might, I fear, reinforce elements of homophobia and machismo and transphobia that exist in both cultures. So I do worry whether, holding on to such an identity may do us more harm than good when it comes to, queer issues.
Erwin, would you like to?
Yes, thank you. So it's a bit blurred in my mind now, but what I want to say, I think in a way, my thoughts start from what, if I heard correctly, Marlena Nika said about violence towards Albanians in Greece. But I think so. Like my point sort of also touches upon what Petros was saying about what to do, what to be done, what is to be done, and this kind of analogy that Dimitris drew between Albanians and Albanians. So where I want to start with a highly speculative, but nevertheless I do stand by it. by position of saying that the immigration of Albanians during the 90s in the Greek society changed something fundamentally about what it meant to be Greek. The presence of this other within this society provided chances for building some kind of self-worth in contradistinction, in juxtaposition with the essential other who was always below the Greek person, right? Like living under the utmost precarious conditions. And it touches upon all these things because indeed, how do you keep a population? How do you keep a social group under oppression? Of course, there must be violence. And of course, there must be violence in different layers. There must be institutional violence. There must be societal violence. There must be, the bullying to which I suppose most of us have been exposed to in school. I hope not all, but in any case, I think it's a very, very widespread practice, a widespread form of discrimination. So why do I want to start by this, right? Because I think that it provides, it takes us some way when we are to answer so for instance, Petra's question, right? Like why is there not much being done? Well, it's difficult because the Albanian is the essential other that serves certain functions, disciplinary functions within the Greek society, and it offers some kind of added value to the experience of being Greek, to Greekness. Yes, and then again, like this idea, I think can take us some way in answering or like let's say in coming into dialogue with Dimitri's analogy, which I mean I think that there's a great difference there because being Albanian and being an Arvanite in relation to being Greek have completely different valuances, completely different ideas associated with them.
Thank you, Irene. That was a really significant aspect that you put into the discussion. And Neritan, yes.
Neritan, you're muted.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. I said that it's really interesting to hear Ervin's position, although I disagree with it, saying that the Greek identity changed fundamentally with the first wave of Albanians. I don't get if it is really fair in the sense that before us there were the colored people. So saying that a Balkan identity strong as the Greek one needs something like that in order to feel superior, I don't quite understand it. But at the same time, I want more and more to speak about the visibility of Albanians in the contemporary Greek scene, such as in the pop culture. You have a lot of theatrical plays, you have a lot of translation, you have a lot of poems, and we have kind of to bring up to the panel the date that it's 2021, because sometimes I feel like it's 2008. I mean, obviously things change really rapidly and really fast, but I guess it's also personal again, because the violence is a huge topic, and you can actually encounter it throughout the Balkans against communities. And yes, it's linked to the sense of identity, because in 1988, you had a cemetery, an Albanian cemetery in Thessaloniki, which I discovered recently. It was under Parko Triandrias. And you had all these elements that belong to different kind of communities. So violence is a huge topic, and I guess it touches another discussion. But at the same time, I would feel that it's kind of a shame to not recognize the process and the figures and the activists that are Greek Albanians, some of them, or German Greeks and so on, that are trying to pull the society through. And in every decade, you had these figures. So again, it's all about not only where you stand and where you come from, but at the same time, where are you staring at and where you want to go. And Eno spoke really beautifully. It's really interesting to see it taking the right distance, because obviously the United States doesn't have the collective memory of any Balkan state or the society structure of it, but at the same time, it has a really beautiful way to not digest, but to help the other one to become one. So the level of coexistence in a really fragile moment of contemporary USA is really interesting also to look at. So this for me.
I don't know if we don't really have time, but as you need to prepare your final statements, I have been reading of other questions, and sorry, I'm reading all the questions from a small screen, and I do make mistakes and maybe missing many as well as the mistakes. Many people are coming back to your points, about intersections and about homophobia and machismo. Many other people are asking, there's a very interesting question about the global, what's the panel's opinion on the impact of global anti-racist movements, such as Black Lives Matter and decolonial politics, on the experience of Greek Albanians. And then there is also a couple of questions that do link Albanians and Greek Albanians, especially in terms of what may happen down the line, something that was asked by the panel, was mentioned by the panel, in next generations. I suppose the way the question is phrased, when you see it again online, actually has this this understanding of perhaps effacement, as happened with Averroes. Of course, I didn't, when I mentioned that, I mentioned it as a cultural background that could be also used in order to bring to us how multiple and deep every national background, deep and diverse, every national background is, not in order to say that it has anything to do with the experience that we heard about today. I'm really sorry if it came across wrongly. So this was, and really sorry for all those who didn't hear their question read. We only had time for this, and back to you for any last comments and statements.
Yes, Neritan, I only see Neritan raising his hand, so.
Something small, it's really funny how difficult it is for us to clear the waters for something really close. I mean, when it comes to a timeline, and now we're speaking about Albanites, which is like a long way back, and in a total different period where nationality was different, totally different, as a sense, maybe it didn't even exist. It was guided by different kind of elements. So it's always interesting to keep a distance and be more free when it comes to identity, because it is personal, and this is the beauty of it. So thank you again.
I know.
I just wanted to register my, this is in response to the question about global identitarian movements like Black Lives Matter. Not that that's a global movement, but it's sort of a non-Greek anyway. And I want to register a little bit of skepticism when it comes to that. And I sort of hinted at that towards the end of my talk as well, because I fear that reinforcing doing identity politics with this label, with the Greek Albanian label, we not only risk not attending to intersectionality concerns that I just spoke about, but also creating bigger divides and inviting all the trouble that skeptics about identitarian politics have been raising for a long time now. So I don't know if at the end of the day we really want to have a robust Greek Albanian identity. I do think that it will serve a purpose. It will help create a sort of a little bit more cosmopolitanism in this very, very, very homogeneous society that Greece continues to be, unfortunately, at least, in its own mind. So I'm sort of on the fence on this issue.
Thank you, Anna. And I think it's time for us to wrap up. We already exceeded our time allotted to us. I just wanted to sort of quickly say that I know, right, this sounds like this roundtable we organized, this sounds like a very specific topic, right, like addressed to a very specific group. But I do think that the issues like we touched today will resonate with a lot of people, right, interested in these dual hyphenated identities, ethnicity, right, and race within and beyond Greece, of course. I want to thank the panelists for agreeing to do this today. It was a great pleasure to hear from you and to learn from you and to be in this roundtable with you, for your excellent and thought-provoking presentations. Thank you to the Greek Studies Now again for giving us the time and the space to have this conversation. Thank you to the respondents for their excellent contributions and your time and your questions, and thank you to the audience who sort of like saw this with us, right, and engaged with us today. Thank you all. I don't know if anybody wants to have any last comments.
I don't have last comments, but thank you for
moderation. Sorry, Ervin, I jumped on you.
Yes, no, it's fine. Yeah, I also wanted to thank everyone for making this possible, especially Maya and Nikki from the Torch for working overtime for us and making this digitally possible. Thank you once again. Thank you very much.
Yes, and thank you to Torch, Maya and Nikki. Thank you all. Dimitris, and would you like to have some closing statements? Okay. You're muted, but I assume you're saying...
just thanking Torch, Greek Studies Now, and Maya and Nikki, who have stayed with us and who have allowed us this extra time. That was a great discussion. Thank you all for joining. Thank you.